Bonsoir, welcome everyone. Thanks to come despite the COVID situation, and thanks to Julie who could travel, which was in question until the last day. My name is Caroline Bourgeois, I'm the curator of the collection. This is the great Julie Mehretu, who came from New York, who lives in Harlem, who's been with the incredible retrospective, which is touring now and still at the Walker Art Center for those who can travel, which is not so easy those days. We know each other for quite a long time, and Julie's been followed by the collection since quite a long time too. She's, of course, a beautiful person in her soul, being very involved with what we call the minorities, so obviously woman's question, gay question, black as a woman, black at all, since a long, long time. And I proposed her to speak about David Hammons. The format changed because in between she worked a lot on the text. The text became bigger and bigger. I will discover it as you. So the text is going to be for something like 40 minutes. And you live nearby, David Hammons also when we met a long, long time ago. And after that, we will have time to have some question if necessary. And she's going to speak slowly for the non-speaking in English, and there is a translation. Thanks, Rudy.
Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Thank you so much, Caroline. And thank you to the Pinault Foundation, Mr. Pinault, for this amazing honor. I was really moved when you first asked me to come here and speak on David Hammons. I've been an enormous kind of enthralled by his work from when I was a very young artist. And I think there are some of us who have these particular artists that are deep touchstones and important for our work, and he's one of those for me. I think also one of the most important living artists from the United States in maybe this generation. So I am again grateful. I think the exhibition here and the installation of his work is really impressive, and it's an honor to be here with you. Thank you for coming out despite the circumstances. Since 2010, when our son was born, I have been fortunate to live with and be the custodian of a Hammons body print, this piece here, untitled, from 1976. For each of our children, I would mark the occasion of their birth with a gift to our family, to honor their birth mother, Jessica Rankin, the incredible miracle of their arrival into this world, her strength and power, and the blessing bestowed on us with them. I spent countless hours staring at this piece, while holding tiniest newborn Haile, cocooned in his blankets, having come to us 6 weeks early, while having breakfast with 5-year-old Cade, arrow drawn on his forehead and arms, conjuring Aang, the last airbender, and while hosting dinner parties, smoking a joint and listening to Getachew Mercuria, summoning sound of his clarinet or saxophone, or Mavis Staples or Ornette Coleman, double doors open to the back deck and neighbors' rear windows, late into the night on my own, wavering candlelight, both children deep in sleep. Also, while smoking joints with dear friends on the yellow sofa, all of us staring at the piece, noting what we see, how what we see mutates. As we were looking, mesmerized, wait, the third eye. While both kids, years older, are off at school, I'm home, just finished with lunch, captivated by Hammons' third eye. How did he do that? This piece is my, or his, or a gauntlet, each day for the past 11 years before leaving the house, if I'm there, while I'm having coffee, preparing breakfast for the children before they get the bus. I feel or see the piece, and I'm directly captivated by its aura, its pull, its mercurial shape-shifting, spectral, haunting, calling, and summoning. If I can make something that day that could come close to what that piece does, that's the gauntlet right there, laid down bare. That's the spirit I feel when I work and try to come close. Just try to touch me. But the thing is this piece doesn't care. It's not about you or me or anyone other than its being, reverberating. That mouth, resounding, blowing, like a blowing horn, listening to Coltrane sax. Oof, damn, a smile about to spread out wide, making the sound of deep appreciation, shaking the head. The gesture, sly, cunning, midst of swaying, hips ephemeral, almost disappearing, like a ghost, but playful. Ooh, a sublime, deep, ancestral wail. Ouch, no, caught, fingers pushing back, fear, horror, captive. In the paper, in the ink, behind bulletproof plexiglass or the screen, imprisoned in a puzzle, an embodied terror of violence of centuries past, eyes squeezed into cuts partly opened, but almost shut. The puzzle pieces, how does the game? The puzzle pieces, the game. How does one play it? Which game? The art game, the capitalist game, the leftist game, the identity game, the life game, squid game? Or how does one put the pieces together? How does one come together to make the mask or identities or the self? How does one put that together in the impossible context of one's identity imposed and flattened by racism and racist tropes? How does one construct an identity of self when there is a violent, repressive, negative antecedent of who they are centuries and days before their being? How does one put oneself together in the white supremacist context of being a poor Black man living in the United States during and then making this piece less than a decade after the ending of American apartheid, segregation known as Jim Crow? Hammons has imprinted his body with a halo of puzzle pieces. It is emphatic insistence that he doesn't carry a prescribed or essential sense of self. He has this kind of composed, elegant being centered in the paper, formal in structure, the imprint of the body of the artist, and then the mortality of the artist in capturing that moment in time. But then also there's a lightness of the fact that you can play with a puzzle again, no matter the construct. One is allowed to play with identity, build it and grow it. It's not a fixed thing. It can be broken up into many parts and pieces. Some pieces can go missing and then found again, but identity is something that is constantly in flux. Then look deeper and longer. Transcendence in the mask of puzzle pieces in the negative space between the fingers that morph into more puzzle pieces. They create the mask with cowrie shells as eyes, the beautiful, sublime, elusive belly form that holds up the mask, recalling aboriginal masks and ritual objects from the motherland and beyond. Through the mouth, the mask becomes a portal. The mouth becomes an eye, the most clearly articulated eye of this piece, and of most of his body prints. The third eye centered in the mask. Look, looking, look harder. The all-seeing eye, a clairvoyant rescue. The deep inner resounding reverberation when seen and felt. A knowledge of liberation that plays with the inner realms, the eye of consciousness resonant in the room. That eye captures you once you see it, feel it. Haunting amulet, a talisman, an idol. David Hammons says, outrageously magical things happen when you mess around with a symbol. The thing about this piece is how it fully encapsulates so much of what makes up the decades-long body of work of David Hammons. Blackness, abstraction, fugitivity, play, jest, puns, gaming, the construct of racism, exposure of the sham, the light and shadows of haunting premonition, myths, marginality, fucking with symbols, working with the spirit, the medium, the occult, the third eye, transcendence. The piece clearly feels fresh. It was made through a creative invention, exploration, and play. There's a kind of lightness to that. It's also very engaged and doesn't feel labored. When I look at Hammons' work in general, and this piece specifically, it feels as if there's no kind of formula, but there's an endless source of brilliance and invention. Part of the invention is found through that light and engaged sense of play, as opposed to work. There is something emphatically exhilarating about experiencing art that doesn't feel heavy or labored. that feels like it just came into being. Conjured, but made through serious knowledge and exploration. Walking through the galleries here again, I was thinking about this talk and it came to me. Again and again, there's always a haunted trace of the body that comes up in the found materiality of the pieces. Either the trace of a body, or the presence of the body, the absence of the body, something used by a body or discarded by one, or even in the mimetic creation of ritual objects, spirited objects by and for bodies. Bodies like his, Black Lives. Quote, with Hammons, you often get as much fatalism as sly gallows humor, because his works take their complex feelings about race, death, and desire into the public square. They presume no transcendence or representation of Black folks as circumstance that cannot be critiqued by the folk themselves. Greg Tate. The basketball nets, the basketball drawings, the video of a can, kicking a can through the street. Some of these works are not in the exhibition, but they precede the works that are in the exhibition. And they're early Hammons public works that he made just in the street. Only one was commissioned by the Public Art Fund. So yeah, the basketball nets, as we saw, the basketball drawings, the video of kicking a can through the street, like Mapping the Studio by Bruce Nauman. Except this isn't a closed-off room where the artist disappears to walk the paces of that space, or the perimeter of that space. This is a New York City street, out in the world where Hammons is kicking a tossed can down the road. The streets, where the only ones who pass real time are transient, houseless, poor folks. Folks that invent with the discarded detritus of the everyday. His titles are not just visual puns, words that make one chuckle. There are always many layers embodied in his play with language, symbols, objects, or images. This piece is in the exhibition here, but I just thought I'd play it for a sec. There are various art historical precedents or contexts that come to mind in thinking of Hammons. And a lot of people, I think what comes up most often is Duchamp and the ready-made. The surrealists, though, and for me, I think mostly of art de povera that emerged across two continents and an ocean, just as Hammons was a student enamored by Charles White in Los Angeles. Art de povera emerged out of Italy at the end of the 60s during the radical political upheaval in the country. This was a decade of the decolonization of most of the globe, the decade of the civil rights struggle in the United States, as well as a decade of the fervent sexual and social liberation and reimagination of democracy and political turbulence in much of post-war Europe and the world. A group of artists all over Italy, part of the radical left, worked to undermine the values of the establishment. Italian artists such as Mario Merz, Michelangelo Pistoletto, and Yannis Kounellis criticized and disavowed the ubiquitous corporate state of affairs with unconventional materiality and contexts. These artists are just a decade older than Hammons, and while they were thousands of miles apart, the gestures of the radical imaginary and rethinking of sociality, this is Kounellis, more Kounellis, politics, gender, race, and sexuality were emergent and infectious globally at the time. Hammons came up under Charles White, alongside artists as Noah Porphyroy, Senga Ngundi, Chris Burden, and Bruce Nauman. Eva Hess was working in New York City. All of his work, in my mind, comes down to a life mining and searching for a visual language of abstraction and blackness. So again, these are early images more of Kounellis, yeah, and again, and you can see such a clear kind of, but it's rarely talked about. You rarely have this conversation between these artists. It's as if Hammons exists in a kind of blank, a kind of space that's decontextualized from the rest of this history, which I think is fascinating. Why? Why does that happen? Clothing, coat prints, of Kunelis, instruments being played by this gas. Porphyry in the desert. Again, more porphyry pieces. They really came up alongside one another. We're studying together. Bruce Nauman in his studio. I mean, a lot of you must know this work. Bruce Nauman stamping in his studio. Chris Burton taking a gunshot, recovering from the gunshot in his arm. This is all work that's being done at the same time that those early body prints are being made by Hammons. Singanagudi, these performances to create these kind of nylon sculptures. Pieces that people would wear as sculptures on themselves. And I brought this Eva Hess into the picture because it also reminds me of some work that's here. Like I was saying, all of his work, all of his oeuvre, comes down to a life mining and searching for a visual language of blackness and abstraction. Or maybe even, as Adrian Edwards suggested to me in conversation, for Hammons himself. These are pieces that you have here in the exhibition, but I thought would just be worth going through as these examples, like the orange is the new black. When so many black bodies are incarcerated in the United States, we have more incarcerated than any other country. And I had pieces, or this, flies caught in a jar. These are pieces that you can see here. So I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on them here, but just to review the kind of the years of mining for a form of this language. And it's not like the ready-made, but it's exaggerated, it's twisted, it's morphed, like jazz does with the context of like really rigorous music. This is a quote by Fred Moten. Perhaps the operations of conceptualization and critique in the art and political world and in the aesthetic sociality of Black life are mirror images of one another. At which point, concerto in blue and black is the infinity room in which our fallenness takes flight. It is a retreat into sensory overload, not deprivation. There's too much light, and soon there will be too much sound. Black stains lack with boom in blur. White is strewn with reflection, continually soiled with some of this funky soul we got here. One can only hear these things in under-illumination. Cannon reminds us, Steve Cannon was a dear friend and poet of David Hammons, who was also going blind as he got older. Cannon reminds us his vision augmented and properly amplified an impairment. What he encounters and describes in Hammons' work is the illumination, grand in being spare, of his own inhabitation, a revelation in opacity that undermines the tendency of the orator to tell it like it is. It ain't is the point. So how do we live with that, he asks, reminding us that Hammons reminds us that art at its best is about beauty and contemplation, which often means that it is about nothing at all. What it is to be about nothing at all is not to be. I have loved, this is a section that's going to really focus on the tar paintings. I have loved Hammons' work for decades, and I'm really moved every time I see a folded paper bag piece, a hair piece, the flag piece, or flying carpet piece, with fried chicken attached. But when I saw the tart paintings for the first time, about 15 years ago, I was awestruck. I stood there for so long in silence, just staring at the shrouded painting. It felt like a haunted memorial, ceremonial piece of an indescribable sublime. It was in the home of a collector friend, and I asked if I could spend some solitary time on her sofa, just absorbing and experiencing the piece. I've said this so many times in my own talks. The painting is slow. I don't care what kind of painting it is. Painting is a slow, time-based medium. It's a slow, time-based experiential art form. From an early tiny medieval Jan van Eyck piece, altarpiece, Veronese's Wedding of Cana down the street, to Rembrandt's Night Watchman, to an Agnes Martin, Sigmar Polka, Robert Rauschenberg, Mark Rothko, my paintings, or these Hammons pieces. Painting is about looking and feeling and sensing, intuiting, and then all over again. It takes time to absorb and experience painting in an embodied way. As a painter and an artist devoted and committed, obsessed by and to abstraction, for how it moved and transformed me as a very young artist, for its illegibility, for the freedom of the invention of language, the myriad visual neologisms of possibility, liberation of imagination in space, in culture, of opacity. I am incredibly moved and humbled by these works in their myriad layers, materially, conceptually, aesthetically, and viscerally. Materially, the works are made up of used or crumpled black plastic bags, or torn and wrinkled clear plastic bags, bags that one sees every evening filled with garbage or recycling on the sidewalks of New York City, outside numerous buildings, depending on when is garbage day. But we also use these bags to carry laundry, cover portfolios, quick and fast raincoats when necessary, carry used clothes and shoes to donate to the church down the streets. These bags get repurposed. Many houseless use them to carry their personal stuff. Collections, clothing, or can and bottle collectors that roam the city going through the recycling left on the streets, making enormous, seemingly floating objects of 6, 10, 12 large bags. They move through the streets tied down to a push cart with a woman or a man usually covered in plastic bags themselves. These bags have their inherent color and plastic film as part of their materiality. But they also have their sociality of their use. But they also have the sociality of their use, gouging, tearing, informing the color and the texture of their materiality. Like we were looking at this piece in the exhibition yesterday, Caroline and I, and when you look at this piece like each decision, while it feels like it's something that isn't, whether and how the way the plastic curls and the color and the reflected color and the reflected color of what you're wearing all inform the way that this painting is experienced. The heavy-duty brown, green, aqua, orange, yellow, red tarpaulins that are usually used and made for protecting and covering things, poly tarps, canvas-coated tarps, open mesh tarps, vinyl tarps. They're all textured differently and are made to be used from everything, from camping, keeping hay and wood dry, tying things down in the back of a truck, or keeping the debris out of the street in construction. In the city, one can see these at construction sites, covering building materials or over sidewalks and scaffoldings. But one also sees houseless folks, like in these are actually images from here, covering their possessions and creating shelter with these. They're used all the way up Riverside Park, north of Harlem, and Morningside Park in the huge, infectious gatherings of barbecues and birthday parties, and other meaningful celebrations that erupt over the weekends, all summer, every weekend, all late into the night. These tarps are shiny when new, but they break down with extended use, and you see them leftovers in the park. They become thin and soft, transparent from when they were opaque. These tarps can have worn through years and years of various use. Broken ropes and ties attached to them, tears and holes that mark them uniquely, socially, historically. The fact that they are beaten up or old, and the fact that they have this sort of independent history outside of their original purpose brings all those other layers of lived experience into their materiality. These are the tarps that we see in Hammons' work. In this way, they echo and become skin, holding their history, the skins of the paintings. They are also the skins that cover the rise of the endless crusade of gentrification in condos, and condo construction in New York City. Open weave, black tarps with hazard orange lines, fontana-like slits in the orange, gray, so the wind can pass through them so as to not make them sails. They adorn and shroud the climbing stories of high-rises under construction, I would drive past this big development in New York City called Hudson Yards over the past number of years, every morning and evening as I went to and from the studio. And it grew in mass from the ground up, first from further north, all the way down the West Side Highway to 26th Street. It was started around, you could see the first developments actually around the 50s. And what's really amazing is these blocks and blocks of glass towers, they become glass towers. But they're most beautiful at this stage. Like once they get that glass skin on them, they lose all sense of their enchantment. And they're for condos and shopping. We have the shed, they call it the Prada bag, and the ever-consuming expansion of late neoliberal capitalism. These tarps cover those structures, taking years of abuse, from the exposure to the weather on the river, which can feel like an ocean, the river's mouth so close by, the wind and sun and rain, construction workers, the continuous wavering or pounding against steel I-beams, steel framing and armatures, concrete molds, plywood, it goes on. These tarps are embedded with those experiences, marked, worn, and torn by them. They carry the stories of hurricanes, heat waves, of days of hard labor by workers who commute in from wherever to build these luxury homes of a bright new future. When I think of a construction site, I think of the sort of raw beauty of the site, and the shrouded armature is a part of that. And then the tarps get discarded and repurposed, somehow. Maybe it's wrapped around a thing to keep it dry, or maybe it's used as a tent by a houseless person, or maybe it's covering a chicken coop in the city garden center, in this case, or whatever. And then it gets repurposed again by Hammons. These are tarps covering a prison where they wanted to keep a different kind of mesh over the windows. They carry the spirits of those that reuse them as shelter covers or covers for their collections of objects in a yard in Queens or under the Brooklyn Bridge. They are imbued with the varied spirits of our time, weather, politics, and marginalized people. They carry these varied experiences of their sociality and their sheer materiality. All of these cosmic events, the souls and spirits that have touched the tarps, are part of the medium and the palette of these paintings. Conceptually, these paintings are squarely in the conversation with painting, and they are part of the expansive field of paint and painting, pushing the potential of the medium. It's not like Hammons is just randomly slapping these materials together and letting them do all the work, conveying some kind of information. He's modulating them, he's pushing them, he's draping them and folding them, he's interweaving them, he's making formal decisions, something new with them. They have become the medium with which he paints. He is pushing the expressive potential of the medium to its utmost. The paintings are expressive in their formal attitude and the social political layers at the same time. Hammons, over the course of a lifetime of making and thought and abstraction, has been working around these topics and subjects so deeply inherent in himself, that when it feels like a simple gesture, it's actually so multifaceted and profound. In certain ways, it's like the most human thing, the way that people use all kinds of materials and repurpose them from one thing to another. One sec. Oops. In certain ways, it's like the most human thing, the way people use all kinds of materials and repurpose them from one thing to another. That as people, we see some potential, some other kind of metaphorical potential in something, or that we see or find some other kind of purpose in an object. The imagination and creativity is an innate part of us as human beings, and has been so forever. Hammons makes from and plays with this most fundamental part of us, while at the same time exposing the sham and conceit of the art world, criticism, and the discourse as something that exists apart from and aside from this very core part of our being. This is a Malevich painting. But also, and I think what's so important in his work, is the simple, beautiful insistence on being by making brilliant works of art while simultaneously exposing the shady, racist, and unscrupulous classism of the art world and the hubris of the narrative of European and white American art history. Hammons has spent his lifetime making with this insight. desire, and a commitment to create and evolve a visual language of abstraction that evolves from the embodied experience of Blackness in the Americas. Aesthetically, these are ferociously complicated paintings. Like I said earlier, they're situated definitely inside the discourse of art history. That means discourse of the history of painting and abstraction. In some ways, it feels as if one could literally chart the history of abstraction through the paintings. The paintings of Turner, Joseph Mallard Turner, in The Mining of the Sublime, and the looseness of the gesture. Mondrian in the formal structure of the stitching of the plastic bags or tarps. Malevich, as you saw earlier, in the black squares. Matisse. Here we go back to what do you call it? Fontana, thank you. And the slides are a little out of order, but just to put them in some context here. And as I was saying, Matisse, Buford Delaney, this is the Turner I was thinking of, Alma Thomas, Frankenthaler, Sigmar Polka, Gerhard Richter. Hammons' formal and adroit use of color, blending, layering. This is Buford Delaney, Abstractions. Morris Lewis, that we mentioned before. Hammons' formal and adroit use of color, blending, layering, pouring in shapes. Fontana in the gouges and cuts and tears and the layers peeking through the underpaintings, and Gilliam in his exuberant dropcloth paintings, Agnes Martin as the master of the sublime through the grid and the simplicity for complexity. I thought of Ellen Atsui, Sam Gilliam, and Mark Rothko immediately when I first experienced the Hammons tarp painting. The elegiac ceremonial drapery of Anatsui, the brilliant exuberance of Gilliam's, and the felt reverberation of the desperate emotion of Rothko. Hammons aesthetically plays with the medium in distinct ways that at first might seem to suggest a cynicism of painting altogether. In Untitled, 2010, we go back. The soiled and torn, tattered and severely wrinkled clear plastic sheets that are draped over an armature of a beautifully articulated, colored, abstract painting on a stretcher. The material here is diametrically opposed to how paintings are usually and meticulously wrapped in fresh sheets of unspoiled virgin plastic. Gallery and museum spaces strive to be antiseptic clean, save for the fine dust that can never quite be eliminated. There's a culture of conservation of the archival of originality. Hammons turns that upside down. One can almost feel a visceral reaction to the dirty plastic and the continual dust it attracts here. It can feel like Hammons is playing an almost throwaway joke on us, the viewers, who have the desire to see the painting as we are accustomed to viewing paintings. I've heard so many actually question the sincerity of his paintings. I think they are very serious and considered. I don't feel or experience these as cynical joke paintings at all. I feel their sheer monumentality and sublime fragility, fluttering as you walk by, while at the same time inverting a culture of insipid elitism. Sure, here we have a bit of Hammons' sly humor, like the cycle of these pieces, the Dirty Money series, a wicked nod to the vast quantities of money in circulation in the art world, along with the love of the wealthy slumming it, in quotes. But that feels like an exceptionally superficial read of these paintings because these works are hauntingly commanding, even if a bit comically wry. Hammons has been making these for the past 15 or 20 years. In fact, I think they're the longest running body of work that he has worked on most committedly. I could be wrong. How, and I really think that many amazing formal decisions are made, like in this here, how the fluorescent orange line of the plastic bags and the ties on the plastic bags create this kind of tie through, this line slice through the painting at eye level, emerging from the saturated dark color underneath in the underpainting. The silver white of the reflectiveness of the wrinkles in the glued plastic, and reverberating with the white kind of splashed marks that are painted underneath they become this kind of explosive mark making. Or the fragility of the clear plastic, as I was mentioning earlier, as it curls on the edge of a tear. A definite obscuring of legibility, like glissant's right to opacity. I could look and keep looking at these and experience them anew each time. There's also something particularly elegiac and mournful and funerary to me about a lot of these paintings. They can be monumental or not that big, some leaning as in temporarily there in transit. But the ornate drapery or decidedly minimal black coverings, these objects resonate with the act of covering and shrouding across many cultures over time. To enter the church or a mosque or a synagogue for service, many devout cover their heads with veils, mantillas, kippas, or topis, taqiyas, hijab, shrouding objects for spiritual purposes, like with voodoo megaliths and shrines, or shrouded stelae, for funerary ceremonial purposes, like covered mirrors for sitting Shiva, or for protecting the object from taking the soul of the newly departed. And for spiritual, religious purposes, like the kiswa here, the cloth that covers the Kaaba, the monolith stone in Mecca, the most sacred site of Islam. It is draped annually on the 9th day of the month of the Hajj, or the act of veiling, like we see here, religious images in Catholicism towards the end of Lent, or simply like a pall, laid over a coffin or a tomb or a shrouded corpse. We have long since protected and covered, and we've long since covered and protected precious objects imbued with spirits, spiritual meaning, or of the departed. These paintings also remind me of two incredibly captivating and moving installations I think I've ever seen. One is the Rothko Chapel and the Black paintings. I'll go back to these. Can you see that? Okay, I can't see anything. I first experienced these paintings when I was just 26 after graduate school. I went to Houston as a core fellow at the Museum of Fine Art in Houston's 2-year artist residency program. And I spent over an hour in the chapel on my first time. As my eyes adjusted to the light and the deep core of these paintings, they would resonate inside of me. They are blue, black, violet black, magenta black, green black. The soft edges of the rectilinear shapes in the paintings emerge and then slide backwards, out of focus, like the breath or mind in meditation. There's a desperate sense of mourning in these works. The paintings were commissioned in 1964, and the chapel was built in 1971. This was a time of enormous turbulence and fervent struggle for the end of segregation and civil rights in the United States. Rothko was painting the Black paintings during this tumultuous time, as well as struggling with his own depression. He died of suicide in 1970 before the completion of the chapel. The other experience was with Ellen Atsui's resplendent, elegiac, monumental exhibition in Munich at the Haus der Kunst. It was Okwuo Enzor's final exhibition before his untimely death during the run of the show, after a long struggle with cancer. I went to see the exhibition with a dear friend, actually the first summer after he died, and it was such a deeply profound experience of mourning, but also a resplendent creative elegy, a metaphoric spiritual place of passage and possibility. It left me breathless in its sheer beauty, but also in its cascading monumentality of the sublime, all created out of junked bottle caps. Like Hammons' shrouded paintings, they ripple as you walk by. They don't feel like death or loss, but something also found and impossible, relentless, like bodies, like skin, holding history, fragility, humor, potential, and embodied life made from that of the discarded. I see them as fugitive, the way Fred Moten writes and thinks of Blackness as fugitivity, as in the ongoing refusal of standards imposed from elsewhere. In quotes, fugitivity then is a desire for and a spirit of escape and transgression of the proper and the proposed. It's a desire for the outside, for playing or being outside, an outlaw edge proper to the now already improper voice or instrument. David Hammons grew up during segregation in a family of 10, him being the youngest. He grew up poor and Black in a world of segregation, systemic violence, and racism. He began making art just after the Civil Rights Act was passed in the United States that officially ended Jim Crow. But we know that didn't end the daily circumstance of prejudice, violence, and exclusion for Black folks. The art world was and still is mostly part of the most elite, white, wealthy, exclusionary cultures. Despite that, and also in spite of that, Hammons has found a way to create a visual language and a culture of Blackness. He has been imaginatively insistent, ferociously inventive, and wickedly wry. The thing is, almost anything he has made has a deep aesthetic of elegance, a beauty exalting Blackness, fugitivity, the everyday, and the marginal, all the while calling out the art world for its hubris, elitism, and hypocrisy. His is a monumental practice of fugitivity. As a friend recently put it, Hammons is making a monument to the impossibility of who I am in this world. That was Adrian Edwards, a good friend of mine. And I think I'll end with this last quote and then a short video. That unlimited finitude that Richard Aiton calls the Black fantastic is Hammons's palette and subterranean pied-à-terre, reverberate with echoes of the phantasmagorical riot and eruption and implosion and retreat at the end of Ellison's Invisible Man. That near drowning in carnival and bullet precipitation. Neither the ending nor the beginning is happy. Born in burial, a detached and an empty hood, an empty hanging noose, and lonely mourner, a chalk outline with a piece of chalk in hand. What did the artist do to be so alone? Nothing but feed back to us a concerto. Let's see if we can see how to roll the stone away. David Hammons is a soloist, primordially blue, primordially none. That's also Fred Moten.
I'm still trying to find out how severed the link was cut between the Afro-American and Africa and the damage that we suffer of that. Everyone talking French and Arabic, and it's just amazing what's been lost through the Atlantic crossing. I was talking with someone in the restaurant, an African, and he said, "Where am I from?" And I was saying, and he was talking about his ancestors, and he said, "No." The Spanish woman said, "Well, where are you from? Where are you from?" So it's the identification of Bill. Since Bill's talking about Ghana and going through the ancestral tree. So I was speaking of being from being from outer space. The possible, and I was thinking, being an Afro-American, because we've lost our link, the possibility of being from, so why not be from outer space? Then deal with earthly issues of association to tribe, geographical area, which comes through Sun Ra. I'm talking about outer space so often, and me being such a disciple of him. To be from another galaxy and not talk so much about the earthly things, which are still the barriers between Senegalese and Mali and the languages. As an American, to create my own identity that fits being an American without not knowing the ancestors. So creating my own identity of being an unknown star might be my grandparents. consciousness. Go to another galaxy with the imagination, and building that opposed to talking about the ancestors and these, which I have maybe but don't have, or a noble person from a tribe I don't even know about. It could be in the galaxy. So creating my own mythology, being at a table where everyone has a literal fact. So that's been interesting being here. Why we do that, or why Duke Ellington decides that he's a duke without lineage, or Nat King Cole decides that he's a king, or the Duke of Earl, you see, or the Thelonious Monk, giving us the royalty that we never have in a fictitious, or maybe non-fictitious reality. But being that without permission, giving ourselves permission to be from another dimension. And then you hear, the music that gives proof to that. And I was telling him, well, the mere fact, he says, well, how do you know you're from another dimension? I said, because I gave myself permission.
That was an excerpt from a video, a film of him being interviewed in Algiers by Matia Diawara in 2009 at a Pan-African conference there. Thank you very much.
A huge thank you. We have a lot to digest. It's the first time I hear a kind of a link in between arte povera, so something which came with a very political and David Hammons, even if we can think of. Thank you for the time also with all the big masters on the. But he speaks. I love that discussion. He speaks very rarely. Very, very rarely. It's There's not so many writings on David Hammons because he refused any exhibition space. So it's not, I know the risk of speaking about him as a painter and as an artist. But for me, he's someone incredible because he built in a way from the despair, from the dirt, and specifically on the painting you're speaking about, the dirt become beautiful. It's beautiful the way he speaks about Nat King Cole, the king, the influence of music, and as a question, maybe you might have some. So Julie does beautiful paintings involving architecture, social sessions, a lot of layers also. Is he someone, because it was the case for me, but now living in Paris, he opened doors to allow you to start from whoever you are, a kind of like Naumann did with the body, so you have the tool you have, which is also your neighborhood. And was it, I call them the artists who open doors, or allow some other to exist.
Was he that? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he was incredibly important to me. I first, knew of his work when I moved to New York City. Didn't really know it before. I did know before I moved to New York City. I went to college in Michigan, and then I went to, and I knew of Adrian Piper's work then. And then it was in New York where I learned of Hammons' work. It was in the early '90s that I moved to New York. And I remember seeing images, and I missed certain shows that were there at the time that I had just moved, just afterwards, because he'd had some important show, I think at Jack Tilton in '91, I think. But he has been, like, for me, one can't stop thinking, I don't think, about Hammons in a really, like, because I don't know how these images look to you, the audience, when you see them on the screen, but you've seen the exhibition here. There was a really phenomenal exhibition a few years ago at White Cube in London that also had, it was mostly just art paintings. And rarely do you see those kinds of exhibitions where Hammons puts together a very formal room in the way that he did. And I think that's also something that can be uncomfortable. But I think there's this deep, sincere kind of desire in what these paintings can do and carry. And I think his desire to not kind of be identified in a particular way, this elusive aspect of his work really, I mean, Mantia Dewar speaks about this a lot, but really pairs with Glissant, who's also super important to me. And one of the reasons I really work within abstraction, because it allows for this myriad of readings, for myriad number of ways of understanding or looking at something, but also for not having to explain the self. And this is something that's so often requested or desired or commanded of artists of color, artists of any kind of marginal situation whatsoever, of women. There's always this kind of work that is required that somewhat explains the self and justifies the self. Where Hammons refuses that, and many artists have. But if you think of Jack Whitten, no one was looking at Jack Whitten for decades. It wasn't until recently. Instead, there were many other artists that were being looked at and regarded. And even if you look at the kind of massive kind of desire of consumption of particular kinds of Black painting now, so much of that work is a form of figuration, a form of almost, what do you want to call it? Even though you have a big figure to show that just called, but I'm not referring to that. But just the kind of, there's this kind of desire for a certain kind of neo-realism that has kind of come back, but it comes from this space of, this is the kind of Black work I'd get. This is when Black work explains itself. But I think with Hammons, he says this many times, there's this refusal of that, but there's this effort of trying to build a visual culture that comes from, and with a visual culture that comes from deep within Black experience or the marginalized experience.
He likes, because he's not seen so much at all, except the galleries, because he has very few shows. There's a very few works of his in Europe, so mainly in Ghent, because he was supported by the Janut. So it's not so frequent for any of us to see a lot. I had the chance to travel, but not. He always included in the last show he did in Los Angeles, that you had some images. He includes some other artists, and not only Black.
Yeah.
He includes Agnes Martin, that he highly respects. And I think his goal, also sort of a Renaissance painting with the drapé, with all that history of layers of tracks.
Yes.
To change that way of looking at abstraction is a lot more difficult, and it was really white. So it takes also that power to change the timeless with something which is normally so disappearing, that he reverse so many things. Maybe we can say a few words also about what we don't see that David also do, like he went to go to Niger, to the Biennale in Dakar. There's some things that we don't know that he does also.
Yeah, so in Dakar, I don't know if you know, but so many of you will, he was invited to participate. He rarely participates in biennials. He was invited, numerous times to participate in the Whitney Biennial. He said no to Documenta and Venice many times. But he participated in the Biennial in Dakar, and what he created was an auction. And he created, it was a raffle actually, it wasn't even an auction, it was a raffle. And these kids would come, families would come, and every day they would raffle off one goat. So the kind of, he speaks about this in this interview again, that was in Algiers, he speaks about that he was in Dakar, and he was really moved to be in Dakar. Melvin Edwards is a close friend of his, and someone he was really moved by early on, had spent a lot of time in Dakar. And so there was a real connection for him there. But also, he wanted to create something that wasn't just for, and he wanted this to be very clear in Dakar, that wasn't for the international art world, it wasn't for the international or the white art world, or these kind of people who come in from elsewhere and land and are there for an opening weekend and then disappear, and the biennial kind of lives its life, and some people go to see it who were there. But he wanted this engaged form of work that had only to do with those who lived in Dakar. And getting a goat was usually reserved for special holidays, for weddings, for births, for baptisms. That's when you get a goat, and you butcher a goat and you make a feast. But he was doing this raffle, so the children were involved in the raffle, and the whole family would get this goat, put it in the back of a taxi and go home. So it was this immense kind of, this beautiful kind of way of working and creating a social sculpture. He really embodies, from what I've read and listened to, he really embodies the shamanistic sense of self in that moment and gets lost in this other form of work and of doing something which is a part of the everyday in a way, but also not.
I had the chance to bump into an unexpected show. I was with Elizabeth on a psychic shop in Harlem. So he also asked you to move. That's about 30 years ago, minimum. So you moved in areas you usually don't go, didn't even knew. So it made you take a lot of conscious of a different reality and world with the Harlem and black neighborhood.
Yeah, I mean, the same thing with the snowball sales. He made this, no one knew. He only brought David Bey, a disciple in a way, to photograph it. But it was never recreated. No one in the art world knew that it was happening. Only a few experienced it. I've heard of him from another Ethiopian friend of mine, seen him on the boulevard, on Adam Clayton Boulevard, making bubbles in the street. That's not for anyone other than those who are driving by.
As it is a bit late, maybe there is a few questions from the public or the friends of Julie.
Julie, you didn't speak about the piece organized by the Whitney, the tribute to Mata Clark. What do you think about it? And what's your interpretation of it?
Well, I didn't really I spoke about that went for the opening and installation, the opening kind of ceremony for that. I spoke. I introduced the work, or spoke a little bit, and gave some words of my thoughts. I think it's an amazing piece. And one thing that I read this really amazing book recently called Sand Future, and I really recommend it. It's a book actually about Yamasaki, the architect of the World Trade Center, and many other buildings in the U.S. And it's wonderfully told by this former artist, or maybe still an artist if he chooses to be again, named Justin Beale. But what I love on the cover of this book is a photograph of the World Trade Center and the beach. So the World Trade Center created Battery Park City, that Battery Park area. This was a beach for years during the 80s while it was being created, and it was used by the Public Art Fund or whatever it was, Creative Time. I can't remember the name of the because I've only read about it. I wasn't there at this time. They used this as a site for public art events. So Sun Ra and his orchestra did a big performance on this place that David Hammons created, this with another artist, created the platform and stage for. The whole side, up that whole Upper West Side Highway, there's a big park right now. It's one of the most some of the most expensive real estate in Manhattan. This, including the Whitney Museum of Art in that neighborhood. This used to be the piers that Balchop has photographed, of cruising communities, places where you'd have kind of like all kinds of transient youth, transgender, kids who didn't have a place to go when they were gay. This was like a gay mecca and place of freedom and possibility inside abandoned piers and inside these old structures. So I think the story of the tribute to Mata Clark, I use quotes, tribute, is again a very Hammons project, because he is names the piece after Mehretu Clark. So there's definitely something there. They were contemporaries, making work at the same time. What's really interesting is Mehretu Clark, when he made the piece that he made there, Day's End, this huge cut inside of the building, he made this kind of almost like a semicircle type of cut, and he was creating, from what I've read, again, I wasn't around, an installation in space, found space, treating the actual pier as a found object, and creating this piece that was considered something like, what did they call it? He called it a cathedral of light and space. But the thing is, this was a place that was filled and used by cruisers. Mehretu Clark locked it up to try and close it off and fenced it off with his own material to try and keep these people out. Well, of course they didn't stay out. They climbed the fence or found ways to cut the thing and go in and use it. And those are the Valtrop photographs you get. So you have all these different layers to how this piece is used and to the history of it. There's also a really interesting history of you'll find all kinds of street arts in New York. We have them here in Paris. You have them everywhere, where different people, houseless people, make homes a particular way or create things a particular way. And the story goes that Mehretu Clark's wife was speaking of some of Mehretu Clark actually also finding inspiration by some of these people as well. So and there's many layers to I think Hammons looking out from the window at the Whitney under construction at this place that has decimated and eradicated, not even decimated, that's the wrong word, but eradicated, completely erased the history of the city that he came up in, that Mehretu Clark came up in. And he looked out and that was the exact location of that piece. So it's many layers, again, like all of his work.
Merci.
Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone very much.